I'll welcome you back as we continue our series looking at the Gospel of John and walking through some of the finer details of the stories that he shares, really exploring the deeper meaning behind what he's sharing. And so we're going to continue that series here with part 6 as we are moving on from chapter 1, and we are making our way now into chapter 2. And in chapter 2, we're going to start off with the wedding at Cana. A discussion here, or a story that John shares with us to report on the first public miracle or sign that pointed to the identity of Jesus. And so we're going to see again the themes of identity and authority being discussed here as we talk about who has authority in regards to the ministry of Jesus, and of course looking at the sign and how it points to the identity of who Jesus is. And so we're going to walk through again some of these details in the story, things that maybe we would just kind of read over and not necessarily pay attention to, but actually are very important details for understanding the interpretation that John has of these events and what they are directing us to, the truth that is being communicated through the events that are happening. And so I invite you to join with me in John chapter 2. Our focus will be on verse 1 through verse 12. So as you find your way there, I encourage you to read along with me. John writes, "On the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. And when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.' And his mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.' Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water.' And they filled them up to the brim, and he said to them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast.' So they took it, and when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, 'Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now.' This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days." So we're going to unpack this beginning in the first verse and talking about some of the finer details here. But of course, the basic story is that Jesus and his mother and his disciples and others had gathered for a wedding in Cana. And we're going to see one of the common issues that happens with weddings is that something will fall apart. There will be some shortcoming. There will be some issue that arises that people in the family and those who are concerned are in the background kind of trying to arrange a solution and try to work that out. And Jesus is going to be brought into the middle of this scenario. And John records it for us because he sees something deeper in it than even just what happened at the wedding. And so we are going to walk through what he is talking about here, why he shares the details he does. So at the beginning here in verse 1, we learned that this is the third day, and they are going to Cana in Galilee where there is a wedding taking place. So there's a passing of a few days here, and as Jesus had initially been down in the southern part of Israel, and he is kind of around the Jordan River, well now he has made his way up north to the Sea of Galilee. We see on the way up that he had encountered Philip and Nathanael, and they had joined with him to follow him where he was going. And in the process of doing this, we also learn that now he has made his way back towards his hometown. Cana was a small town that was several miles or thereabouts from Nazareth, kind of in the nearby area. And so they are in a region around where his hometown is. So they are invited to a wedding in Cana. We see that Jesus is there, his disciples are, because they are, whether they were directly invited or not, they are now associated with Jesus. They are his guests because as his followers or as his disciples, and he is their rabbi, wherever Jesus goes, the disciples are going to go with him. So they are brought in by default, whether or not there was an invitation to them specifically. And then, of course, we see that his mother was there also. Now we're kind of getting an idea here by the fact that his father is not mentioned, that Joseph has probably passed away at this time. But we see a reference here to both Jesus and his mother being at this wedding. Now, we don't know whose wedding this is. There's no mention given. There's some speculation that perhaps this was John, the gospel writer's wedding, that was being mentioned, because there's no reference directly to him. But again, that's pure speculation. We really don't have any context or anything in the passage that gives us that idea. It's just some scholars suggesting a possibility. So we really have no idea who this wedding is for. who the bridegroom is, who the bride is, but I think ultimately that's part of the point, is that the bride and bridegroom are not mentioned, because ultimately that's not really what the story is about. John isn't concerned with the wedding details and who is getting married. The message or the story is about Jesus and what he does at the wedding. So identifying the people who are being married or their relation or connection to Jesus and Mary, it's not really important to understanding the purpose of the story as John sees it. So we don't know who is being married, but we can reasonably assume that they are probably related to Mary and Jesus, that there is a family connection here, and if not a family connection, at least a very close friendship or something like that. Obviously, as today, weddings were very important. They were spectacles. They were social gatherings. There were opportunities for family reunions, large family gatherings. And so like today, you would invite your family, you'd invite some friends, people like that to celebrate with you. Now, one of the interesting things about how all of this worked out, though, is that in the ancient world, in this context, weddings were not just a few hours in an afternoon. There was actually a large celebration that would last, potentially a week, where they would celebrate for a long period of time. And so you imagine the difficulty we have of being able to coordinate all the things we do for a few hours and having to supply food and drinks for receptions, to be able to supply just for, an hour or two in a reception hall. Now imagine having to supply food and drinks and things for people for up to a week. So you can see it's a very large, need that is going to be met at these kinds of celebrations. And so the fact that Jesus and Mary are both invited tells us obviously that they have a connection with whoever is being married. We also can learn, because of Mary's involvement in this, that she seems to be taking it upon herself to look after some of the needs of the lack of wine and things like that she probably has an even closer connection. So you could reasonably believe that this is a relative of theirs, and that because it is a nearby town and because Mary is taking such a vested interest in making sure that the needs at the wedding are being met, that she is doing that because she is kind of taking on a mothering or a guiding role in this. So it would reasonably be understood that this is probably a relative of their family in some way, and that's why they are at this wedding. But ultimately, that identity of the person is not really important, because the identity of Jesus is ultimately what John wants us to focus on. So we are introduced in verse 3 to the fact that there is a problem at this wedding. As most every wedding is going to have at least one problem arise, or something that is taking place that's going to be a problem that those who are working in the background are going to try to fix. Well, in this case, the problem at the wedding is that they run out of wine. And so Jesus is approached by his mother, and she tells him the problem. She says they have no wine. So she is trying to take care of this, and of course in her understanding it's going to require some kind of miracle or something, and she is approaching Jesus because she believes that Jesus can solve the problem. Now, the interesting thing about this is that of course no one else really knows what Jesus is capable of. He hasn't performed any public miracles or signs or anything like that at this point, so no one has any expectation or understanding of who he is. His ministry is not public. Now, he has been baptized in the Jordan River. He has been referred to as the Lamb of God. He has some disciples following him. But at this point, he hasn't really revealed himself in the form of doing miracles and signs that would point to the power that he has, in his divine nature. So this is interesting to see the discussion here that we have between Jesus and his mother, because his mother very clearly understands and knows who he is. She was the one who gave birth to him, and she received the message from the angels, and so she is aware of the fact that he is the Son of God, even if no one else at the wedding is aware. And she apparently has an expectation that he can solve this problem somehow. And we are going to learn about that based on the exchange that the two of them have. So she presents him with the problem that they have run out of wine, and again, this would be a significant issue for the viewpoint or the perspective of the family, with the bridegroom and the family and all of them being responsible for providing and the needs of the wedding and making sure that there's enough wine and food and things like that for people to celebrate throughout the week, that naturally this is going to be an issue. And it would reflect very poorly on the family if they were to run out of that and not have what they needed. It would be a problem that it would put them in a bad light. It would be a very embarrassing thing for them, and so culturally it would just not be a good look. And so Mary is concerned about this reflecting poorly on the family, and so she is going to him and saying, we have a problem, and I'm sure you can fix it. So she's asking Jesus to fix the problem. Now, the response Jesus gives has been discussed throughout history as terms of what he's meaning here and what kind of attitude he has when he says this, because it sounds pretty interesting. Jesus responds to his mother, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now, the idea of calling your mother woman, at least in our culture, would be weird. I can't imagine my mom approaching me and asking me to do something and me responding and saying, "Woman, this isn't my problem." Right? Like if you read it or understand it in that sort of tone, the idea of referring to someone like your mother as woman just does not make sense in our culture. We don't do that. However, in the culture that we are looking at here in Jesus' day and in the situation, the context that we have, we don't need to understand this as being insulting or offensive in any way. Of course, we know Jesus was perfect. He never sinned. And so nothing he's doing in this interaction is sinful. He's not disrespecting his mother. And of course, if we're looking at Jesus and trying to understand the attitude or the way in which he's saying this, you can understand even better by the context of the Gospels. Because Jesus doesn't refer to his mother as woman just this one time. He also refers to her as woman in a different setting. If you were to go to the end of his earthly ministry, when he was crucified on the cross, that John, as we are going to learn at the end of this gospel, that John and the mother of Jesus were standing there present at the cross when he was dying, and Jesus, being concerned for the welfare of his mother, makes sure that she is taken care of after he is gone. Because he, as the oldest son, would be the one who was responsible for caring for her, considering that she was apparently a widow. And so he was responsible for her. Well, he wasn't going to be around to take care of her, and loving his mother and caring about her, he refers to her again as woman in that situation. He tells John, "Behold, this woman is your mother now, and woman, this is your son." So he refers to her again at this term of woman, but he's doing it while he's dying on the cross, and he is seeking to make sure his mother is cared for. So clearly we don't need to take this as some sort of insult. Jesus is not meaning it in that way. He's certainly not saying it with any sort of attitude like that. He is saying this in a way that is certainly still respectful and concerning. We also see Jesus use the term woman in other contexts, and usually it's when he is talking with women who are coming to him with some sort of need, where they have an ailment or something that they are seeking healing for, and he endearingly refers to them as woman. Or Mary Magdalene, when she is in the garden and she is weeping because of the death of Jesus and she doesn't realize who she's talking to, he again refers to her as woman. So his use of this word is not in any way offensive or meant to be taken in that way. It is something that culturally makes sense, and one that clearly from Scripture is a term he used when he was being gentle and delicate with women that he was encountering. So that's one thing we need to understand. The next thing that's interesting is he says, what does this have to do with me? Or what is this to you and me? Why is this a matter of concern between us? Why would you bring this to my attention? What's so important about this problem? And again, the interesting thing here is, what is his meaning with this? Why is he making this comment to his mother? Because he follows it up and says, "My hour has not yet come." Now we can understand, based on the response, whether this is every single word that was stated between the two, or we're just getting a synopsis, kind of the basic points that John is sharing with us. We at least can learn a little bit contextually about the question that's being put forward and the answer that Jesus is giving. So she says they have no wine. Now clearly it's implied that she's asking or expecting Jesus to do something about it. And the fact that Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come," would indicate that he understands she's asking him to perform a miracle or do something that would reveal his identity. Something that would demonstrate that he is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God. And his response to her is suggesting that he is not prepared to do that just yet, or that it is not her responsibility to take that ministry on herself. So what we can learn from this is that, one, Jesus is still being respectful. However, in his response, with her bringing the problem to him and expecting him to perform some sort of miracle in order to fix this issue, Jesus' response to her is indicating the fact that he refers to her as woman, which again is not offensive, but he's also not calling her mother. Now, the reason that he is saying, "Woman, what is this issue to me? My hour has not yet come," is he is clearly stating to her, this is not your area of authority. Right? This is going back to the idea of who has authority in Jesus' ministry, who has authority to claim his identity, who has authority to determine who Jesus is or to tell him what to do. And in this situation, Mary is kind of overstepping her boundaries here. That yes, she is his mother, he is her son, and she has authority over him, and Jesus submitted to her as her son. But when it comes to his ministry as Messiah, she didn't have authority over him in that regard. That was something that only the Father in heaven had authority in. And so when she approaches and says, basically, you need to fix this problem, you need to step in and perform a miracle or do something to solve this, Jesus is letting her know calmly and affectionately and caringly, but sternly, this isn't your area of authority. You can't determine what I'm going to do. You can't tell me what to do ultimately as Messiah. I am your son, but you are not the one who is giving me my task and my mission in terms of what it means to be the Son of God. And so he is making that clear to her. He's saying, my hour hasn't come yet. You don't get to determine when my hour is. I'm waiting for the Father to give me that determination. So this is a very interesting response that he gives as he is presenting that. It's very important for us to understand and see that he's kind of distancing himself from her in that regard. This is also a similar idea if you were to go back into Jesus at the age when he was a child. Basically the only story we have of Jesus before he was an adult and was being baptized is that we learned that at one time where the family is going to the temple and they are going to one of the celebrations, one of the feasts, that when the parents leave, when Mary and Joseph leave with the family and everything, that they look around them and realize that Jesus was not with them. And so they go back to Jerusalem trying to find him. And they find him in the temple basically teaching the Pharisees and the scribes who were in awe of how a 12-year-old thereabouts could be able to teach them. And so the question or the situation there that Jesus responds to, he says, didn't you know I have to be about my Father's business? Right? That his parents are very understandably upset and concerned, and they are frustrated that he has not been with them. And as you can imagine, if you found out your child had stayed behind and you were missing them for a few days, you would also be panicked and probably be prone to scolding them for not being with you. But Jesus' response clearly indicates, I am being about my Father's business, meaning you are my parents and I am submitting to you, but when it comes to my ministry, you don't have authority over me in that regard. I am submitting to my Father in heaven when it comes to those kinds of things. And so this is what Jesus is indicating here. He's saying, Mary, you're my mother and I love you, I submit to you, but when it comes to me and my ministry, my mission here on earth, that is for my Father in heaven to determine, not for you. And so that's a very important statement that is being made. However, we see in the response in verse 5 that Mary says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And this means, again, we're probably missing maybe some extra little words here that John just doesn't record because they don't need to be, or that there are some things that are being unsaid, right? You can communicate a lot without words in your body language, your facial expressions, your tone. And it is clear based on Jesus' response that while he is cautioning her and he is making something clear to her, he is indicating that he will do something, right? He is making an indication saying, look, you're not in authority over me in this particular area. However, he must be indicating to her that he is willing to do something, right? That he will step in and do what she has asked. And so she responds and tells the servants, just do what he tells you, right? She leaves it in his hands and says, all right, I've done my part. I've let him know the problem. I'm going to let him take care of it. And so she lets him do what he will do and instructs the servants, follow his orders. Whatever he tells you to do, go along with it. So we get into verse 6 now. It says that there were 6 stone water jars that were there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So these were jars that were used for ritual cleansing. It was an important part of Jewish practice according to the law to be cleansed, especially before you would eat, that you were to wash your hands and you were to, they would have bowls or they would have water that was available that would be used to have a ritual cleansing of your hands and make sure that you were clean before you would sit down to eat. And so this was an important part of those practices, and that's what John is pointing out here. He's saying that the jars that were there were for the Jewish rites of purification. Now, this is going to be an important thing to understand, is that he's not telling us this for no reason. There's a specific reason why he identifies that the jars were for the Jewish rites of purification, that they were ritual jars. They were specifically used for people to do their cleansing according to what the law of Moses commanded. Because John is going to be, like many of the gospel writers, he is going to be focusing on the contrast between the law of Moses and the ministry of Jesus, and how Jesus fulfilled that but ultimately surpassed it. And that's what's going to be happening here. So there's some imagery that is being presented here that Jesus is taking something that represents the old covenant, something that represents the law of Moses, the time before him, and he is going to be bringing new life to it. He is going to be using it for his own purposes and giving it a new meaning or a new purpose. And that's something that is going to be happening throughout his ministry, and an idea that John is going to communicate time and time again through his the recordings that he has of Jesus' teachings and of his signs to come. So, Jesus instructs the servants to take these 6 stone water jars, these ones that were used for cleansing, for purification, and he is going to tell them to fill the jars with water, because apparently they were out of water at this point. And Jesus says to them to fill the water, and they filled it up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. Now, we're not going to learn at what point the water becomes wine. Obviously it does, but we're not really filled in on it the point at which this happens, because they fill it with water and at some point it becomes wine. We don't really know when. We don't know, at what point that transition happens, but ultimately it does, as we can see from the response of the master. Now, one of the interesting things here is that he is instructing them to take it to the master of the feast. The master of the feast was someone who was kind of like in a sort of office over the wedding, someone that would be appointed, maybe an official, or someone that was respectable in the community or had some sort of influence that would be considered to be the master of the feast. That would kind of oversee it, maybe kind of like a wedding planner or something like that in our terms. It's not necessarily someone who was planning all the details of the wedding in their context, but just someone who was kind of an official who had a position overseeing all the events that would take place at the wedding. And so he is the one who ultimately is the recipient of the first wine that Jesus makes. And so they take it, the servants take it, and of course the master, we're told, doesn't know what happened, but he tastes the wine. When he drinks the water, when he draws the water out of the vessel, that he drinks it and he tastes it, and it is better than any of the wine that has been served to that point. And we see his response. He's saying, everyone serves a good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. Meaning, usually people give their best at the beginning. At weddings, the typical process was to present people with the best wine at the beginning, and then when they were kind of further down the process, you would kind of get into the lesser wine that wasn't as high quality, when people may not care so much about the quality of the wine anymore, or wouldn't notice as much. And so he is saying, usually at weddings, that's how that goes, is you serve the best wine first, and then you follow it up with some of the poorer quality wine. However, apparently the wine that Jesus produces here with this miracle is better than any that they've had before. And so he is remarking at the idea that at this wedding, not only have they managed to continue to have a supply of wine, but the wine that is being served here towards the latter part of the wedding is even better than what was served at the first. And so that not only does this become a situation where the family of the bridegroom is not embarrassed anymore, but now they are respected, because they are seen as providing even better wine later on in the wedding. They're doing, it's getting better with age, basically. And so Jesus, in performing this miracle, is not only, he's taking something that would have been a situation of shame and embarrassment for a family, and now is turning it into a situation where they are going to be respected and actually looked up to and admired for the way in which they have carried this on. Of course, without their involvement, or really maybe not even knowing what was going on to begin with, because Mary is the one who ultimately is taking care of this, or bringing it to Jesus. So the master of the feast makes this remark, and then John tells us that this is the first of his signs that Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So we don't know if everybody at the feast was aware of what happened. Clearly the disciples were and the servants were, and it makes sense that word would travel. Mary would be aware, and so it would make sense that eventually word would get out. But whether everyone at the wedding feast knew what had gone on and that a miracle had been performed, we don't really know. But ultimately, we see that the disciples do, and they believe in Jesus. That this is a beginning step in their belief to understand, okay, Jesus is not just a great teacher. He has miraculous ability. He has power from God that he is able to transform something like water and make it into wine. So they develop in their understanding and faith in regards to who Jesus is. But John refers to this as the first of his signs. He doesn't call it a miracle. He calls it a sign. Now, if you think about the purpose of a sign points you in the direction of something, or it gives you the identity of something, right? When you're driving down the road, you have a stop sign, and it gives you some sort of command. Or you have signs that will identify like railroad crossing, or will show you that there's a curve coming in the road. The sign itself is, the reason it exists is not for its own sake. It's to give you an indication of something that is coming up. It's to give you a warning or to give you some sort of information to say, you need to slow down because there's a curve coming, or you need to get ready to stop, or you need to be ready for a railroad to cross, and you need to be alert and look out for things. So signs exist in order to identify something that is coming up, in order to point to the identity or the location of something, right? And so in this case, when John says that this is a sign of Jesus, what he means is that the turning the water into wine in and of itself isn't really all that important. What's important is the fact that Jesus did it and what that miracle says about Jesus. What is this miracle? What is turning water into wine? What does that tell us about Jesus? What truth is it pointing us to or directing us to? Well, in this case, again, going back to the stone water jars, Jesus took something that was dependent upon the old covenant, something that was there, that was being used at the wedding because the Jewish people there were following the old covenant, they were following the law of Moses. He is taking something from the old covenant, from the law of Moses, and he is using it for his own purpose. He is bringing new life into it, right? So there's some symbolism here where you have the jars that are used for the water of purification, for cleansing, that they are empty. That there is no water in them. They are empty. They are hollow. There is nothing in them. And Jesus directs the servants, and they fill it up with water. And from that, Jesus provides this fresh, fruit of the vine, this fresh wine, this high-quality wine. He presents something that will bring joy and celebration to the people at the wedding. So in a lot of ways, this story, what John is pointing us to is that there's kind of an analogy going on here that Jesus takes the old covenant, what was hollow, what ultimately was missing real life. It was missing water. There wasn't anything to it that would give you life. And Jesus is filling it with water. He is filling it with what will give you life. And out of that, when people draw out of what Jesus has given us or what Jesus has provided to us, when we draw water from Jesus, it's going to give us cause for celebration. And what he provides will be even better than what came before. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of imagery that John is directing us to. And so that's the first sign that is being presented here. It's showing that Jesus takes something from the old covenant, from the law of Moses, something that was empty, that ultimately was not serving its purpose at that time, and he is filling it with water. He is filling it with something that is life-giving, and he is producing out of it something that is a cause for celebration and joy and glory. And this is also revealing that Jesus has the power to transform something, to create wine out of water, or something that ordinarily should not be able to happen. And then it tells us that after this happens, that he went down to Capernaum, kind of crossing over from Cana to Capernaum, another town that was on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. And he goes with his mother. It mentions also his brothers and his disciples, and they stay there for a few days. So again, they're all kind of traveling together and staying together as they head to Capernaum. And that's going to be our transition towards the next part of the story that John is going to share with us. But as you're looking at this is the first of several signs that John is going to highlight. And the point behind sharing this is to direct us to the deeper meaning. Turning the water into wine is a tremendous miracle, but the sign, the idea or the truth that is actually being communicated here is that Jesus takes something from the old covenant, something that was from the law of Moses, and he is reinvigorating it. He is producing something joyful and something new and something life-giving that comes out of what was hollow and empty before him. And so that's going to be an ongoing theme that John is going to share with us. And I want you to pay attention as well, because as we get into later miracles and discussions, the idea of being able to draw water from Jesus, to draw living water, is going to come up in the story of the woman at the well in chapter 4. It's going to come up in a later chapter with him in one of the festivals in Jerusalem. And so there's going to be this ongoing theme of drawing life-giving water from Jesus and having a reason to celebrate because of that. But I want to thank you for joining us again as we have covered the 6th part of our study. And next time that we meet, we will be discussing Jesus and his cleansing of the temple, which follows beginning in verse 13. I hope you have a wonderful day, and God bless you.